The Severodvinsk shipyard stretched endlessly into the Arctic fog, a graveyard of Soviet dreams rusting in the pale morning light. Viktor Petrov clutched his wife Elena's weathered hand as they approached the massive hull of the Admiral Kuznetsov's sister ship, a carrier so classified it never received an official name. The cleaning contract was their last hope before eviction, a job so dangerous and underpaid that only the truly desperate would accept it. But Viktor hadn't told Elena the truth. 40 years ago, he wasn't just a naval engineer, he was the man who helped design this very ship's most secret compartment, the compartment that officially never existed. As they climbed the rusted gangway, Viktor's blood ran cold. The entry hatch that should have been welded shut hung open like a screaming mouth. Someone had been here first, inside the bowels of the ship, past corridors thick with radiation warnings in 3 languages. Elena's flashlight beam caught something impossible. Fresh boot prints in the dust leading toward the reactor room. What was someone looking for in a ship that had been empty for 30 years? Elena stopped abruptly, her beam fixed on the disturbed dust. "Viktor, these prints, they can't be more than a day old." Viktor's mouth went dry. He forced himself to keep walking, pulling Elena gently along. Probably just security guards. You know how bureaucrats are. They inspect everything twice. But his heart hammered against his ribs. The prints were wrong. Too deliberate, too purposeful. Someone knew exactly where they were going. The carrier groaned around them, metal singing its death song in the Arctic wind. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness ahead, each drop echoing like a countdown. Viktor remembered when these corridors buzzed with life. Sailors rushing to stations, the thrum of engines, the electric anticipation of a ship that was more than she appeared. Elena shivered and pulled her worn coat tighter. "This place gives me the creeps. How long did you say you worked on ships like this?" "Just briefly," Viktor lied. "Standard construction. Nothing special." They passed through a blast door that hung askew on its massive hinges. The radiation symbols here were larger, more urgent. Elena's flashlight swept across Cyrillic warnings that made Viktor's blood freeze. "Authorized personnel only. Project Northern Star. Lethal force authorized." Elena couldn't read the old military script, but Viktor could. Project Northern Star, the code name that still haunted his dreams. "The contract said the ship was decommissioned in 1991, Elena said, studying a maintenance log bolted to the bulkhead. "But look at this. There are entries here from 1995, 1998, even 2003. Viktor leaned over her shoulder, his face carefully neutral. The handwriting in the later entries was different, rushed, desperate. The final entry was just 2 words in English, "They know." "Probably just caretaker visits," he said, but his voice cracked slightly. They descended deeper into the ship's belly. The air grew thicker, tasting of metal and something else, something organic and wrong. The boot prints continued ahead of them, accompanied now by drag marks, as if someone had been pulling something heavy. Elena stopped again, her breathing quick and shallow. "Viktor, I don't like this. That man who hired us, Volkov, he was lying about something. I could see it in his eyes." Viktor remembered Volkov's pale face, the way his hands trembled when he'd handed over the contract, the way he'd insisted they start immediately, before the weather turned, before someone else could get to the ship first. "We need this money, Elena. Our pension won't cover the rent increase, and—" A sound echoed from somewhere ahead. Metallic, deliberate, like a hatch closing. Elena grabbed Viktor's arm. "There's someone else on this ship." Viktor's mind raced. The secret compartment was 3 decks down, hidden behind what appeared to be a water recycling station. If someone had found it, if they'd accessed what was inside, the implications made him dizzy. "Maybe we should go," Elena whispered. "No." The word came out harsher than Viktor intended. Elena looked at him in surprise. He forced a smile. "We've come this far. A few more hours and we'll have enough to pay the rent for 6 months. But Viktor wasn't thinking about rent anymore. He was thinking about the small metal cylinder he'd helped install in the ship's hidden heart 40 years ago. A cylinder containing something that could reshape the world's understanding of the Cold War. or start a new one. The boot prints led deeper into the ship's maze, toward the reactor section and beyond, toward secrets that were supposed to stay buried forever. Elena followed reluctantly, her flashlight casting dancing shadows on the corroded walls. Neither of them noticed the figure watching from the darkness behind them or the soft click of a radio transmitter sending a message into the Arctic night. "The old engineer is here, proceeding as planned." The morning mist clung to the harbor like a shroud as Viktor and Elena made their way down the crumbling concrete pier. Their breath formed small clouds in the frigid air, and the sound of their footsteps echoed off the water. Viktor pulled his worn jacket tighter around his shoulders, glancing nervously at the looming silhouette ahead. The Kirov stretched before them like a steel mountain, its hull rising from the dark water in a series of rust-stained terraces. Even in decay, the aircraft carrier commanded respect, nearly 300 meters of Soviet engineering that had once ruled the northern seas. Now it sat motionless, waiting for its final dismantling. "Christ!" Elena whispered, craning her neck to take in the full scope of their task. "How are we supposed to clean all of that?" Viktor hefted his toolbox and trudged toward the gangway. One deck at a time, same as always, but his voice carried little conviction. In 20 years of industrial cleaning, he'd never faced anything quite like this. The gangway groaned under their weight, metal fatigue evident in every rivet and weld. Safety rails had been removed, leaving only a narrow walkway between them and a 20-meter drop to the oily water below. Elena gripped Viktor's arm as they climbed, her knuckles white against his sleeve. They emerged onto the main deck to find themselves in a maze of twisted metal and debris. Cables hung like dead snakes from overhead structures, and pools of stagnant water reflected the grey sky. The smell hit them immediately, a cocktail of rust, fuel oil, and something else Viktor couldn't identify. Something organic and unpleasant. "The manifest says we start with the crew quarters," Elena said, consulting the water-stained papers their foreman had given them. "Decks 3 through 7. Viktor nodded and led the way toward a hatch marked with Cyrillic characters. The heavy steel door stood partially open, revealing a corridor that disappeared into darkness. He clicked on his flashlight and stepped inside. The beam cut through shadows thick as velvet, illuminating walls lined with pipes and electrical conduits. Their footsteps rang hollow on the metal deck plates, creating an eerie percussion that seemed to follow them deeper into the ship's belly. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, a steady rhythm like a failing heartbeat. The first crew quarters were exactly what Viktor had expected, small compartments stripped bare of anything valuable, bunk frames bolted to the walls, lockers hanging open, floors littered with debris and rodent droppings. They worked methodically, Elena sweeping, while Viktor hauled out the larger refuse. It was on the 5th deck that they found the first anomaly. Elena had been working her way through a junior officer's quarters when her broom struck something that shouldn't have been there. She knelt and brushed away the accumulated grime, revealing a section of deck plating that didn't match the rest. The metal was newer, the welds cleaner. "Viktor," she called, "come look at this." He abandoned his own cleaning and crouched beside her. The section was roughly 2 meters square, with what appeared to be hidden hinges along one edge. Viktor ran his fingers along the seam, feeling for a mechanism. "It's a hatch," he said, "but it's not on any of the ship's plans." Elena glanced around the empty compartment. Why would they put a hatch in the floor of crew quarters? Viktor found the release mechanism hidden beneath a false rivet head. The hatch opened smoothly, revealing a ladder that descended into absolute darkness. A wave of stale air rushed up from below, carrying that same organic smell they'd noticed on deck, only stronger now, almost overwhelming. "We should report this," Elena said, backing away from the opening. "Report what? That we found something that might be worth salvaging?" Viktor shone his light down the shaft. The beam revealed perhaps 3 meters of ladder before vanishing into shadow. "Our contract says anything we find is ours to keep." "I don't think that applies to secret compartments, Viktor." But he was already swinging his leg over the rim. 5 minutes. We take a quick look, see if there's anything valuable, and then decide what to do. Elena grabbed his arm. "This feels wrong. Ships don't have secret rooms." "Soviet ships do," Viktor replied. "You know how paranoid they were. Probably just a storage compartment for sensitive equipment." Against her better judgment, Elena followed him down the ladder. The shaft was narrow, forcing them to descend single file. Viktor's flashlight beam danced wildly as he climbed, creating a strobe effect that made the descent feel like falling through a nightmare. They emerged into a corridor that definitely wasn't on the ship's original blueprints. The walls were lined with the same newer metal as the hidden hatch above, and the air hummed with the faint vibration of machinery that should have been long dead. Emergency lighting strips glowed dimly along the ceiling, powered by some unknown source. "The power's still on," Elena whispered. Viktor nodded grimly. After 15 years of abandonment, nothing aboard the Kirov should have been operational. Yet here they stood in a hidden section of the ship that seemed very much alive. The metal groaned beneath their feet as Viktor led Elena deeper into the carrier's bowels. Their flashlights carved weak tunnels through the darkness, revealing glimpses of corroded pipes and peeling paint that hung like diseased skin from the bulkheads. The air grew thicker with each level they descended, heavy with the smell of salt, rust, and something else, something organic that made Elena's stomach turn. "How much further?" Elena whispered, though she wasn't sure why she felt compelled to keep her voice low. The ship felt abandoned, yet somehow watchful, as if invisible eyes tracked their every movement. Viktor consulted the crude map Petrov had sketched for them. 2 more levels. The engine room should have the most valuable salvage, copper wiring, brass fittings, maybe even some intact electronics. They reached a heavy watertight door marked with Cyrillic warnings that Elena couldn't fully read in the dim light. Viktor spun the wheel mechanism, his muscles straining against decades of corrosion. The door finally yielded with a shriek of protesting metal, revealing a corridor that stretched beyond their flashlight beams. "This doesn't look right," Elena said, studying the passage. Unlike the deteriorating sections above, this area showed signs of maintenance. The walls were cleaner, the floor clear of debris. Overhead, she could make out what looked like recently installed ventilation ducts. Viktor stepped inside, his boots echoing strangely in the confined space. Maybe they kept this section sealed. Could mean better pickings. They moved forward cautiously, their lights revealing doors along both sides of the corridor. Most bore standard naval markings, but others displayed symbols Elena didn't recognize, geometric patterns that seemed almost mathematical in their precision. At the corridor's end, another watertight door blocked their path, but this one was different. Where the others showed rust and age, this door gleamed with a dull metallic sheen, its surface unmarked by time. "Viktor," Elena said, grabbing his arm, "look at this door. Really look at it." He directed his beam across the surface, his expression growing puzzled. "It's new, or at least newer than everything else." He ran his fingers along the edge where it met the frame. "This seal is intact, completely intact." A soft hum emanated from beyond the door, barely audible but unmistakably mechanical. Elena pressed her ear to the cold metal and heard it more clearly, a rhythmic pulsing like a heartbeat. "There's power down here," she breathed. "Active power." Viktor's face hardened with determination and something else, greed. "Then there's something worth protecting, something valuable." He attacked the door's wheel mechanism with renewed vigor, but this one didn't yield to brute force. After several minutes of futile effort, Elena noticed a small panel beside the doorframe. She pried it open with her multi-tool, revealing a keypad with Cyrillic numerals. "It's electronic," she said. "We need a code." Viktor cursed under his breath, but Elena was already studying the keypad. Years of salvaging Soviet equipment had taught her to recognize patterns. The numbers showed wear, but not random wear. Specific digits were more worn than others. She pressed the most used numbers in order of their deterioration. The lock clicked open. "How did you—" Viktor began, but Elena shushed him as the door swung inward, revealing a sight that defied explanation. The chamber beyond was vast, its ceiling lost in shadows above. Banks of monitors lined the walls, their screens flickering with data streams in multiple languages. In the center of the room stood a series of glass cylinders, each filled with a pale, luminescent fluid. But it was the contents of those cylinders that made Elena's blood freeze. Suspended in each tube was a human figure, their bodies perfectly preserved, connected to the apparatus by networks of tubes and wires. Their faces were peaceful, almost serene, but their skin had an unnatural pallor that made them look more like sculptures than people. "Bоже mой," Viktor whispered. "What is this place?" Elena moved closer to the nearest cylinder, her hands trembling as she held up her flashlight. The face inside was young, perhaps 25, with Slavic features and close-cropped hair. A nameplate at the base of the cylinder bore Cyrillic text and what looked like a service number. "They're soldiers," she said, her voice barely audible. "Soviet soldiers." A computer terminal near the cylinders still glowed with active displays. Elena approached it carefully, noting dates and numerical sequences that made no sense. But one date stood out, repeated across multiple screens, 1962. "Viktor," she called, her voice echoing in the chamber. "These readings, they're current, active. These people, they're not dead." Before Viktor could respond, a new sound filled the air, the distant rumble of engines approaching across the water. Elena rushed to a small porthole and peered out. 3 boats were heading directly toward the carrier, their searchlights sweeping the water. "We need to leave," Viktor said, backing toward the door. "Now." But Elena remained frozen at the terminal, staring at the data streams. Whatever this place was, whatever these people were, someone had been maintaining them for over 60 years, and now that someone was coming back. The emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red as Viktor and Elena descended deeper into the carrier's bowels. The air grew thicker with each level, carrying scents that didn't belong on any ship. Ozone, burnt metal, and something else Viktor couldn't identify, but made his skin crawl. "The blueprints showed standard engine rooms here," Elena whispered, consulting her waterproof tablet. The deck plans she'd obtained from the salvage company were proving increasingly useless. This corridor shouldn't exist. They stood before a sealed bulkhead door, marked with Cyrillic warnings Viktor recognized from his military service. "Authorized personnel only, radiological hazard." But below those familiar red stencils, someone had spray-painted newer words in English. "They're still listening." Elena ran her fingers along the door's edge, finding the magnetic lock mechanism. "It's powered." After 30 years, she pulled out a small device from her toolkit, something that definitely wasn't standard cleaning equipment. "Where did you get that?" Viktor asked, watching her attach leads to the lock circuit board. "You're not the only one with secrets." The lock clicked open with a soft hiss. "I told you I had debts. Some people pay very well for access to places like this." The compartment beyond defied explanation. Banks of computers lined the walls, their screens flickering with data streams in languages Viktor didn't recognize. The technology looked decades ahead of anything the Soviets possessed in the 1980s. Sleek interfaces, holographic displays, processing units that hummed with impossible efficiency. But it was the centerpiece that made Viktor's blood freeze. A cylindrical chamber dominated the room's center, filled with cloudy fluid and connected to dozens of cables. Inside, suspended like a specimen, floated something that might once have been human. Its limbs were elongated, skin translucent enough to reveal altered bone structure beneath. Electrodes pierced its skull at regular intervals, pulsing with soft blue light. "Jesus Christ," Elena breathed. "What were they doing down here?" Viktor approached one of the active computer terminals. The screen displayed vital signs: heart rate, brain activity, cellular regeneration rates, all active, all current. "Elena, this thing is alive." She joined him, her face pale in the monitor's glow. "Look at these dates." The experiment began in 1962, but the last data entry was... She scrolled through the logs. Yesterday. The implications hit Viktor like a physical blow. The carrier hadn't been abandoned. Someone was maintaining this facility, continuing work that began during the height of the Cold War. But who, and why keep it secret for 3 decades? A soft chime echoed through the chamber. The suspended figure's eyes opened, milky white and unblinking, staring directly at them. Its mouth moved in the fluid, forming soundless words. "We need to leave, now." Viktor grabbed Elena's arm, but she shook him off. "Wait, I'm downloading everything." Her fingers flew across a portable drive's interface as data streamed from the terminal. This could be worth millions. Genetic enhancement, life extension, neural interface technology. Worth millions to who? Viktor's military instinct screamed danger. "Elena, who are you really working for?" Before she could answer, new lights blazed to life throughout the chamber. Hidden speakers crackled with static. Then a voice emerged, distorted, electronic, but unmistakably human. Unauthorized access detected. Containment protocols initiated. Steel barriers slammed down across the exits. The chamber's atmosphere systems roared to life, and Viktor felt pressure building in his ears. Through the observation windows, he saw similar chambers in adjacent rooms, dozens of them, each containing its own suspended occupant in various stages of transformation. "The download's not finished," Elena said, panic creeping into her voice as she watched the progress bar crawl forward. 40%, 50%. The voice continued its mechanical countdown. Security teams dispatched. Estimated arrival, 6 minutes. Viktor examined the barrier blocking their escape. Solid steel, magnetically sealed. But the chamber's original Soviet construction offered another option, the ventilation system. He pried open an access panel, revealing a shaft just wide enough to crawl through. "Forget the data. We go now or we don't go at all." 70%. Just a few more seconds. The suspended figure's vital signs spiked on the monitors. Its mouth opened wider, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth that definitely weren't human. The fluid around it began to bubble and drain. "Elena!" She yanked the drive free and dove for the ventilation shaft as their captive prison began to empty. Viktor hauled her up into the narrow space just as alarms throughout the ship began wailing. Behind them, they heard the chamber's seal breaking with a wet, organic sound. They crawled through darkness, following air currents toward what Viktor hoped was an exit. Below them, heavy footsteps echoed through the corridors, too many to count, moving with military precision. "Who did you make that deal with?" Viktor demanded as they crawled. Elena's voice carried fear for the first time since he'd known her. "I thought they were corporate researchers. Industrial espionage. But this—" She clutched the drive against her chest. "This is something else entirely." Behind them, something inhuman screamed. The corridors deeper inside the carrier felt different, colder, despite the humid air that should have warmed every inch of the massive ship. Viktor's flashlight beam cut through darkness so complete it seemed to swallow the light itself. Behind him, Elena's breathing had grown shallow, quick bursts that echoed off the metal walls. "The blueprints I studied," Viktor whispered, pausing at a junction where 3 passages branched off like arteries. "None of these corridors should be here." Elena pressed closer, her shoulder touching his. "Maybe they're service tunnels, for maintenance crews." But even as she said it, something felt wrong. The walls here weren't showing the rust and decay they'd encountered topside. Instead, the metal gleamed dully under their flashlights, as if it had been treated with some kind of protective coating. More unsettling still were the symbols etched into the bulkheads, not Cyrillic letters or standard Soviet naval markings, but strange geometric patterns that seemed to shift when Viktor wasn't looking directly at them. They chose the middle passage, following what felt like a gentle downward slope. The air grew thicker with each step, carrying an odd metallic taste that made Viktor's tongue feel numb. After what seemed like an eternity of walking, they reached a heavy door marked with warnings in multiple languages: Russian, English, and something else neither of them recognized. "Biologicheskaya opasnost," Elena read slowly. "Biological hazard." Viktor examined the door's locking mechanism. Unlike everything else they'd encountered, this showed no signs of age or corrosion. The electronic keypad beside the handle still glowed with a faint amber light, as if drawing power from some hidden source. "That's impossible," Elena breathed. "This ship's been dead for 15 years. Before Viktor could respond, the keypad beeped softly. Numbers began appearing on its small display, a sequence counting down from 30. Neither of them had touched anything. "Run!" Viktor grabbed Elena's hand. "Now!" They sprinted back down the corridor as the countdown continued behind them, their footsteps ringing like gunshots in the confined space. At 15 seconds, they heard the door beginning to cycle open with a pneumatic hiss that sounded like something breathing. At 10 seconds, a new sound emerged, a low humming that seemed to come from everywhere at once. They reached the junction and kept running, taking the leftmost passage this time. The humming followed them, growing louder, more insistent. Viktor's flashlight began to flicker, the beam weakening as if something was draining its battery. There, Elena pointed ahead to what looked like another door, this one already standing open. They tumbled through it and found themselves in a vast chamber that defied everything they thought they knew about the carrier's layout. The space was enormous, easily 3 stories high and stretching further than their lights could reach, but it was what filled the chamber that stopped them cold. Massive cylindrical tanks lined the walls, each one roughly the size of a shipping container and filled with a glowing blue-green fluid. Within that fluid, dark shapes floated suspended like specimens in some impossible laboratory. Viktor approached the nearest tank, his legs moving despite every instinct screaming at him to flee. The shape inside was roughly humanoid but wrong in ways that made his eyes water when he tried to focus on it. Too many joints in the limbs, fingers that branched and rebranched like coral, and worst of all, what might have been a face that seemed to track his movement despite showing no signs of life. "Viktor, look at this!" Elena's voice came from across the chamber, tight with fear. He found her standing before a bank of monitors that had somehow remained functional. Green text scrolled across their screens in multiple languages, but it was the English sections that held his attention. Subject Batch 7A, Cellular Integration, 94% complete, Neural Pathway Reconstruction, Ongoing, Project Designation Glubina, Estimated Time to Consciousness Restoration, 47 hours. Project Depth, Elena translated the Cyrillic. "What were they doing down here?" More text appeared, as if responding to her question. "Deep ocean recovery successful, specimens acquired, Mariana Trench. Depth 10,994 meters. Hybridization protocol authorized by Directive 7 Red. Warning, containment protocols active." The humming sound grew louder, and now Viktor could see its source. The tanks were beginning to glow brighter, their occupants stirring within the viscous fluid. In the nearest container, the thing that might once have been human pressed what could have been a hand against the glass. "We need to leave," Viktor said, but his voice came out as barely a whisper. "Now." Elena was already moving toward what looked like another exit when every monitor in the chamber flashed the same message simultaneously. "Containment breach detected, lockdown initiated, unauthorized personnel identified, elimination protocol active." The chamber lights blazed to life, revealing dozens more tanks they hadn't seen in the darkness, and in every single one, something was beginning to wake up. The emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red as Viktor and Elena stumbled through the carrier's bowels, the alarm's wail echoing off the metal walls like a banshee's cry. Behind them, footsteps thundered, heavy boots on steel decking growing closer with each passing second. "This way," Elena gasped, pulling Viktor down a narrow maintenance corridor barely wide enough for their shoulders. The air reeked of machine oil and something else, ozone, sharp and electric, like the moment before lightning strikes. Viktor's lungs burned as they pressed deeper into the ship's maze. The strange symbols they'd seen in the laboratory flickered through his mind, not Cyrillic, not any alphabet he recognized, And those photographs, those impossible photographs of landscapes that belonged on alien worlds, the ventilation shaft, Elena whispered, pointing to a grate overhead. We can... The lights cut out. Absolute darkness swallowed them whole. Viktor's hand found Elena's in the void, her fingers ice-cold and trembling. They stood frozen, listening. The alarm had died with the lights, leaving only the distant hum of generators and the soft ping of cooling metal. Then they heard it, a voice calm and measured, speaking in accented English over what must have been the ship's intercom system. Dr. Kozlov, Dr. Petrov, please respond. We know you're aboard. There's no need for this to become unpleasant. Viktor's blood turned to ice. How did they know their names? They'd given false identities to the harbour master, paid in cash, left no paper trail. Elena's grip tightened on his hand. In the darkness, she leaned close enough that he could feel her breath against his ear. The photographs, she whispered so softly he almost missed it. Did you see the dates? He had. 1953, 1957, 1962, years when this carrier was supposedly still under construction in Severodvinsk, years before it ever touched water. Yet the images showed it floating in impossible seas beneath foreign stars. Emergency lighting flickered back to life, dimmer now, painting their hiding spot in weak amber. Through the grate above, Viktor could see shadows moving, search teams spreading through the upper decks with military precision. The laboratory we found, Elena continued in that ghost whisper voice. It wasn't built for marine research. Viktor knew. The equipment they'd glimpsed, electromagnetic field generators, particle accelerators, devices that belonged in theoretical physics papers, not aboard a naval vessel. And the walls, lined with those strange metallic panels that seemed to bend light around them. The voice crackled over the intercom again. You've seen the Koche archive. You understand what's at stake. Cooperation is your only option. Koche, the deathless one from Russian fairy tales, the sorcerer who hid his soul in impossible places. Viktor almost laughed at the absurdity, but the sound died in his throat as footsteps approached their corridor. Elena tugged him forward, toward a maintenance hatch marked with radiation warnings in 3 languages. The metal was warm to the touch, thrumming with subtle energy that made Viktor's teeth ache. They crawled through darkness that felt thick as syrup, following pipes and conduits toward the ship's heart. The temperature rose steadily, and Viktor began to sweat despite the damp cold that had plagued them since boarding. The tunnel opened into another chamber, this one vast and cylindrical, stretching up beyond the reach of their flashlight. Banks of machinery lined the walls, not Soviet technology, not anything Viktor recognized. The designs were too elegant, too integrated, as if they'd grown rather than been built. "Oh my God," Elena breathed. In the center of the chamber stood a sphere of impossible geometry, its surface shifting between states of matter, now solid metal, now liquid mercury, now something that wasn't quite either. It pulsed with its own inner light, and Viktor realized this was the source of the ozone smell that had followed them through the ship. Documents were scattered on nearby workbenches, yellowed with age but still legible. Elena grabbed one at random and held it up to the light. Viktor saw equations that hurt to look at, diagrams of machines that shouldn't exist, and at the top of the page, a stamp in red ink, Project Koshi, eyes only. Displacement field stable at 0.3 Tesla, Elena read aloud. Temporal variance within acceptable parameters. Recommend immediate transition to Phase 3 trials. The footsteps were getting closer. Voices echoed down the tunnel they'd just traversed. Calm, professional, inexorable. Viktor snatched up another document, this one covered in photographs. Ships he didn't recognize sailing under skies the wrong color. Cities with architecture that defied physics. And people, or things that looked like people, standing in landscapes that belonged in fever dreams. They weren't exploring space, he realized. They were exploring somewhere else entirely. Elena's face had gone white. In her hands was a manifest, dated 6 months ago. Fresh supplies, recent deliveries. Whatever Project Koshi had been in the Cold War, it hadn't ended with the Soviet Union's collapse. It was still running. The chamber's lights blazed to life, and armed figures in black tactical gear poured through every entrance, weapons trained on the two cleaners who'd stumbled into secrets that could reshape reality itself. The emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red as Viktor and Elena descended deeper into the carrier's bowels. The metal corridors seemed to pulse with each flicker of the backup power, creating shadows that danced like specters along the bulkheads. Elena's breathing echoed in her mask, each exhalation a reminder of their dwindling air supply. "The documents mentioned Level 7, Viktor whispered, consulting the water-damaged papers they'd found in the captain's quarters. "Something called Project Zerkalo." Elena nodded, though her attention was fixed on the Geiger counter clipped to her belt. Its occasional clicks had become more frequent as they descended, but still within acceptable ranges. Whatever had happened here, the radiation wasn't immediately lethal yet. They reached a heavy blast door marked with Cyrillic warnings and biohazard symbols. Unlike the other barriers they'd encountered, this one was sealed with an electronic lock that somehow still functioned. A small LED blinked green beside a card reader. "How is this thing still powered?" Elena asked, running her gloved fingers along the pristine metal surface. While everything else on the ship showed decades of decay, this door looked as if it had been installed yesterday. Viktor pulled out one of the key cards they'd discovered in the safe. The first one produced an angry red light and a harsh buzzer. The second card, however, caused the lock to chirp softly. With a pneumatic hiss, the massive door began to slide open. The chamber beyond defied explanation. Banks of humming computers lined the walls, their displays casting blue light across pristine white surfaces. The air here was different, cleaner, processed by filtration systems that shouldn't exist on a decommissioned vessel. Most disturbing of all, everything appeared to be operational. "This is impossible," Elena breathed, approaching one of the computer terminals. The screen showed a complex diagram of what looked like a human brain, cross-sectioned and annotated with technical specifications in both Russian and English. "This equipment, some of it looks newer than anything I've seen in Moscow." Viktor moved to another workstation where dozens of photographs were spread across the surface. His blood chilled as he recognized faces from old newspapers and history books, politicians, scientists, military leaders from both sides of the Iron Curtain. But these weren't historical photos. These people appeared to be in clinical settings, their eyes vacant, electrodes attached to their skulls. "Elena, look at this." He held up a photograph dated 3 months ago. The subject was a man he recognized from recent news broadcasts, a current member of the European Parliament, who'd been pushing for stronger ties with Russia. In the photo, the man lay unconscious on an examination table while technicians in white coats worked around him. Elena's sharp intake of breath made him turn. She stood frozen before a wall of monitors, each displaying what appeared to be live feeds. The images showed locations around the world, government buildings, corporate headquarters, private residences, all from the perspective of security cameras or hidden surveillance equipment. "Viktor," she said slowly, "look at the timestamps." Every feed was current. As they watched, people moved through the monitored locations in real time. One screen showed the interior of what looked like the Kremlin. Another displayed the U.S. Capitol building. A third revealed the interior of a mansion where men in expensive suits sat around a conference table, completely unaware they were being observed. A soft sound behind them made both cleaners spin around. A section of the wall had slid away, revealing an elderly man in a pristine lab coat. Despite his age, his eyes were sharp and alert, studying them with the intensity of a scientist examining specimens. "You're earlier than expected," he said in accented English, then switched to Russian. "Though I suppose the timeline has always been flexible." Viktor instinctively stepped in front of Elena, though they had no weapons. "Who are you? What is this place?" The old man smiled, and there was something unsettling about the expression. "I am Dr. Alexei Volkov. As for this place," he gestured around the room with obvious pride, This is the future of human civilization, or perhaps I should say, the present. We've been operational for quite some time now. This ship was decommissioned in 1991, Elena said, finding her voice. The ship, yes. But Project Zerkalo continued. We simply found it convenient to let the world believe this facility no longer existed. Volkov moved to one of the workstations with the fluid grace of someone much younger. Tell me, have you noticed anything unusual about global politics lately? The way certain leaders seem to change their positions overnight? How international crises resolve themselves in ways that benefit particular interests? Viktor's mouth went dry as the implications began to sink in. The photographs, the brain scans, the surveillance feeds, it all pointed to something that should exist only in the realm of science fiction. You're talking about mind control, Elena whispered. Volkov's smile widened. Such a crude term. We prefer cognitive restructuring, and you, my dear cleaners, have just become part of the most important experiment in human history. The metallic taste of fear filled Viktor's mouth as they descended deeper into the carrier's bowels. Elena's flashlight beam danced across walls lined with pipes and conduits that seemed to pulse with an alien geometry. The air grew thicker, charged with an energy that made the hair on his arms stand on end. Look at these markings, Elena whispered, running her fingers along symbols carved into the bulkhead. They weren't Cyrillic, weren't any alphabet Viktor recognized. The etchings seemed to shimmer in the flashlight's glow as if they were somehow alive. A low hum resonated through the deck plates beneath their feet. Viktor grabbed Elena's arm, pulling her back as a section of wall slid open with a pneumatic hiss. The passage beyond yawned black and uninviting. Someone's still here, Viktor breathed. This place isn't abandoned. Elena nodded toward the fresh boot prints in the dust at their feet. Size 11, military issue, no more than a day old. We should go back. But Viktor was already moving forward, drawn by a compulsion he couldn't explain. The corridor stretched ahead, lined with doors bearing those same strange symbols. Emergency lighting flickered to life as they passed, triggered by motion sensors that should have been dead decades ago. The first door stood ajar. Viktor pushed it open and immediately recoiled. The room beyond was pristine, sterile white, filled with equipment that belonged in a laboratory, not on a Soviet warship. Centrifuges hummed quietly. Computer screens displayed scrolling data in multiple languages. And, in the center of it all, a glass cylinder filled with swirling, luminescent fluid. Bože moj, Elena gasped. What is this place? Viktor stepped closer to examine the cylinder. Something moved within the fluid, not quite liquid, not quite gas. It pulsed with its own internal light, responding to their presence. As he watched, patterns formed and dissolved in its depths, like thoughts made visible. A photograph lay scattered on the nearby desk. Viktor picked it up with trembling fingers. The image showed a group of men in naval uniforms standing beside what looked like a crashed aircraft. But the craft was wrong, too smooth, too seamless, with curves that hurt to look at directly. 1962, Elena read from the date stamp. The Cuban Missile Crisis. This wasn't about missiles, Viktor realized. It was about this. Footsteps echoed in the corridor behind them. Viktor and Elena froze, listening to the measured tread of military boots approaching. The sounds stopped just outside their door. I know you're in there, a voice called in accented Russian. American, Viktor thought. Step out slowly, hands visible. They had no choice. Viktor set down the photograph and raised his hands, Elena beside him. They emerged to find 3 men in black tactical gear waiting for them. The leader, a grey-haired man with cold blue eyes, held a pistol trained on Viktor's chest. Dr. Marcus Webb, the man introduced himself. And you two are very much in the wrong place at the wrong time. We're just salvagers, Elena said quickly. We don't know anything. Webb's smile was winter cold. That may have been true an hour ago, but you've seen too much now. He gestured toward the laboratory. Do you understand what you're looking at? Viktor remained silent, but his mind raced. The strange symbols, the advanced technology, the photograph of the impossible aircraft, pieces of a puzzle that stretched back 60 years. First contact, Webb continued. October 1962. Soviet Northern Fleet encountered something that shouldn't exist. Instead of reporting it to Moscow, Admiral Volkov decided to study it. Biggest intelligence coup of the century, and the Americans never knew. Until now, one of Webb's men added, "The Cold War was a sideshow," Webb said. "While our governments played with nuclear weapons, a few of us on both sides were preparing for something far more significant. The Admiral and I, we understood what was really at stake." The luminescent substance in the laboratory pulsed brighter, as if responding to the conversation. Viktor could feel it pulling at his thoughts, whispering secrets in languages that predated human speech. "You killed him," Elena said suddenly. "The Admiral. He didn't die of natural causes." Webb's expression didn't change. Volkov was losing his nerve. Wanted to go public. After 60 years of careful research, he would have thrown it all away for some misguided notion of transparency. "So you murdered him." "I preserved the future of our species." Webb stepped closer, the pistol never wavering. This technology could transform everything: energy, transportation, medicine. But it has to be controlled, managed by those with vision. Viktor understood now why they'd never be allowed to leave. They'd stumbled into something vast and terrible, a conspiracy that spanned decades and crossed all national boundaries. The rusted carrier above was just a shell, hiding secrets that men would kill to protect. But as Webb prepared to end their lives, Viktor noticed something the American had missed. The substance in the laboratory was glowing brighter, and the symbols on the walls were beginning to respond. Whatever had crashed in 1962, it wasn't entirely dead. The emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red. As Viktor and Elena stumbled through the carrier's bowels, the aliens' psychic screams still echoing in their minds. Behind them, the sound of heavy boots thundered through the corridors. Kozlov's men had breached the ship. "This way," Elena gasped, pulling Viktor toward a maintenance shaft she'd spotted during their initial exploration. The metal grating screeched as they pried it open, the sound seeming impossibly loud in the confined space. Viktor squeezed through first, his cleaning supplies clattering against the shaft walls. The confined space reeked of rust and something else, ozone, like the aftermath of lightning strikes. As Elena followed, sealing the grating behind them, they could hear voices in the corridor below. "Spread out. Check every compartment. They can't have gone far." The shaft stretched ahead into darkness, barely wide enough for their shoulders. Viktor's flashlight beam revealed a junction ahead where the maintenance tunnel split in 3 directions. As they reached it, Elena grabbed his arm. "Wait," she whispered. "Listen." Through the metal walls, they could hear something that made their blood freeze. Not the sounds of human pursuit, but something else entirely. A rhythmic tapping, like Morse code, but coming from multiple directions at once. "The others are waking up," Viktor realized, his voice barely audible. "Whatever that thing did when it screamed." Elena nodded grimly. During their time in the laboratory, they'd counted at least 7 containment units. If the psychic burst had activated all of them, Kozlov's men were walking into a nightmare far worse than 2 escaped witnesses. They chose the left passage, crawling through the cramped space as quickly as they dared. The shaft sloped upward, and Viktor hoped it would lead them to the upper decks, where they might find another way off the carrier. The tugboat that had brought them was long gone, but there had to be emergency craft somewhere on this massive ship. The tapping sounds grew louder, joined now by the unmistakable screech of metal being torn apart. Whatever the entities were, they were breaking free of their restraints. Viktor tried not to imagine what decades of imprisonment might have done to their already alien minds. There, Elena pointed ahead, where the shaft opened into what looked like a ventilation chamber. They squeezed through the opening and found themselves in a small maintenance room filled with pipes and electrical panels. A narrow ladder led upward through the ceiling. As Viktor climbed, His hand touched something wet on one of the rungs. In the flashlight beam, his fingers came away stained with something that wasn't quite blood, darker, with an oily iridescence that seemed to move on its own. They emerged into what had once been the carrier's communications center. Banks of outdated Soviet radio equipment lined the walls, most of it stripped for parts years ago. But in the corner, covered by a tarp, Viktor spotted something that made him grab Elena's shoulder. A shortwave radio, he breathed. If it still works. Elena was already moving toward it, her engineer's instincts taking over. She pulled away the covering to reveal a relatively modern communications setup, not Soviet era, but something installed much more recently. The equipment hummed softly, indicating it was still powered. "This isn't military surplus," she muttered, examining the radio's specifications. "This is current technology. Someone's been using this place as an active communications hub." The implications hit them both simultaneously. The laboratory below wasn't just a Cold War relic, it was an ongoing operation. The entities weren't just being stored, they were being studied, communicated with, possibly even controlled. Elena's fingers flew over the radio controls, searching for an emergency frequency. Static filled the air, punctuated by fragments of distant voices speaking in languages that didn't sound entirely human. She fine-tuned the frequency, and suddenly a familiar voice crackled through the speaker. "Containment breach in sectors 4 through 7. Repeat, multiple containment breaches. All units fall back to perimeter positions." It was Kozlov, but his usual composed demeanor had cracked. In the background, they could hear sounds that defied description. Not quite screams, not quite mechanical noise, but something that made their teeth ache. Viktor grabbed the microphone. "Kozlov, this is Viktor Petrov. We know what you're doing here. The whole world needs to know." A moment of static. Then Kozlov's voice returned, cold and deadly calm once again. "Mr. Petrov, you've caused considerable inconvenience, but perhaps we can reach an understanding. You've seen what we're dealing with here. These entities, they're not just alien, they're a threat to everything human civilization represents. So you imprison them, study them. We protect the world from them, and sometimes, when necessary, we protect the world with them. You have no idea what's really at stake here, what's coming. The Cold War never ended, it just moved beyond this world." The radio suddenly erupted with inhuman sounds, and Kozlov's transmission cut to static. The emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red as Viktor pulled Elena through the maze of corridors. Behind them, the sound of boots on metal grew closer, accompanied by urgent Russian voices that echoed off the steel walls. "This way," Elena gasped, yanking him left into a narrow maintenance passage. The carrier groaned around them, its ancient bones protesting as it rode the swells. Water dripped from overhead pipes, creating a steady percussion that masked their footsteps. Viktor's mind raced as they moved. The documents they'd found in the hidden laboratory painted a picture so devastating that his hands still trembled. Project Lazarus wasn't just about biological weapons, it was about resurrection. The Soviets had been experimenting with reanimation of dead tissue using a combination of radiation exposure and synthetic compounds derived from deep-sea organisms. "The samples," he whispered urgently. "Elena, we have to destroy the samples." She shook her head, pressing her back against a bulkhead as footsteps thundered past their hiding spot. "We need to get off this ship alive first. The world needs to know what happened here." A new voice joined the hunt, American speaking in clipped military tones. Viktor's blood chilled. This wasn't just about Russian secrets anymore. Someone had been watching, waiting for people like them to uncover what lay hidden in the carrier's depths. They emerged into a wider corridor, and Elena suddenly grabbed his arm. "Look!" she breathed. Ahead, emergency lighting illuminated something that made Viktor's stomach lurch. Scratch marks gouged deep into the metal walls, as if something with tremendous claws had tried to tear its way through solid steel. The marks were old, but the terror they represented felt immediate and raw. The experiments didn't stop when the ship was decommissioned, Elena realized. They continued them here, in secret. A distant scream echoed through the ventilation system. High, inhuman, and filled with rage. Viktor grabbed Elena's hand and they ran, no longer caring about stealth. Whatever the Soviets had created in their desperation to win the Cold War, it was still alive somewhere in this floating tomb. They burst into what had once been the ship's medical bay. Surgical tables stood covered in rust-colored stains that might have been blood or might have been something worse. Glass containers lined the walls, most empty, but some still holding murky specimens that seemed to writhe in the flickering light. "My God," Viktor whispered, approaching one of the tanks. Inside, something that had once been human floated in preservative fluid. Its eyes had been replaced with mechanical sensors, its limbs enhanced with crude cybernetic attachments. The face was frozen in an expression of perpetual agony. Elena was examining a computer terminal that somehow still had power. "Viktor, you need to see this. The project files, they're all here. Everything they did, every test subject, every failure." Her voice broke. "There were children, Viktor. They used children." The sound of tearing metal erupted from somewhere above them, followed by more of those inhuman screams. Whatever had made the claw marks was moving, hunting. "We can't leave without copying these files," Elena said, frantically working at the keyboard. "The families of these victims deserve to know what happened." Viktor kept watch at the door, his makeshift weapon, a piece of broken pipe, feeling utterly inadequate. Through the porthole, he could see lights approaching across the dark water, more ships, more people who would kill to keep these secrets buried. "Elena, we're out of time." "Almost got it," she muttered, inserting a drive into the terminal. 30 seconds. A sound made Viktor's blood freeze, something large moving through the corridors above, accompanied by a wet, dragging noise. The emergency lighting flickered, and in the brief darkness he saw eyes gleaming from the ventilation grate. Not human eyes. 20 seconds, Elena whispered. The grate exploded inward, and something dropped into the medical bay with a wet thud. Viktor's mind struggled to process what he was seeing, something that had once been human but had been twisted by science into a nightmare. Radiation burns covered its flesh, and the cybernetic enhancements sparked and twitched with damaged circuitry. "Got it!" Elena yanked the drive free just as the creature turned toward them with a grinding of mechanical joints. They dove through the far exit as claws raked the air where their heads had been. The corridor beyond led toward the flight deck, their only chance of escape before the approaching ships cut off all exits. Behind them, the creature's roar shook the entire ship, a sound of rage and pain that spoke of decades trapped in this floating prison. Viktor understood now why the carrier had never been properly scrapped, why it had been left to rot in international waters. Some secrets were too dangerous to bring to shore. They had to survive long enough to expose the truth. The metal corridor stretched endlessly before them, emergency lighting casting eerie red shadows on the walls. Viktor's breathing echoed in his helmet as they descended deeper into the carrier's bowels, following the faint electromagnetic signature Elena's scanner had detected. The air grew colder with each step, their breath forming small clouds despite the environmental suits. "The readings are getting stronger," Elena whispered, her voice crackling through the comm system. "Whatever's down here, it's still active after all these years." Viktor paused at a junction where 3 passages converged. Cyrillic markings on the walls indicated they were now in a section labeled Special Operations, authorized personnel only. The paint was fresher here, less corroded than the upper decks they'd explored. "This doesn't match any carrier blueprints I've seen," he muttered, consulting the schematic on his tablet. "According to the official plans, this entire section shouldn't exist. It was supposed to be additional fuel storage, nothing more." A low humming sound drifted from the leftmost passage, barely audible but unmistakably mechanical. They exchanged glances through their helmet visors before moving toward the source. The corridor ahead was different, cleaner, with smooth walls that seemed almost organic in their curves. The Soviet industrial aesthetic had given way to something sleeker, more advanced. Elena stopped abruptly, grabbing Viktor's arm. "Look at the walls." He followed her gaze and felt his stomach lurch. The metal surfaces weren't reflecting their helmet lights normally. Instead, the illumination seemed to bend and flow across the walls like liquid mercury, creating patterns that hurt to look at directly. "That's not possible," Viktor breathed. But even as he spoke, he knew they'd moved far beyond the realm of possibility hours ago. They pressed forward, the humming growing louder with each step. The passage opened into a vast chamber that defied the carrier's architecture entirely. The ceiling soared at least 40 feet above them, supported by pillars that twisted upward in spiraling helixes. Banks of equipment lined the walls, technology that looked decades ahead of anything the Soviets had possessed in the 1980s. In the center of the room sat a massive cylindrical structure, easily 20 feet in diameter and stretching from floor to ceiling. Its surface was covered in a hexagonal pattern that pulsed with soft blue light, the source of the electromagnetic readings. Cables snaked away from its base, connecting to control stations positioned around the chamber's perimeter. "My God," Elena whispered, approaching one of the consoles. The displays were still active, showing readouts in multiple languages, Russian, English, and others Viktor didn't recognize. "Look at these power consumption levels. This thing has been running continuously for decades." Viktor circled the cylinder, trying to understand what he was seeing. Through transparent sections in its surface, he could make out a complex lattice of crystalline structures suspended in some kind of fluid medium. The crystals rotated slowly, their faceted surfaces catching and refracting the blue light into mesmerizing patterns. "Elena, you need to see this," he called out, his voice tight with tension. She joined him at a control station where a monitor displayed what appeared to be a star chart. But the constellations were wrong, nothing like the familiar patterns visible from Earth. The display showed coordinates, distance measurements, and what looked like communication protocols. "This is a beacon," Elena said, her scientific training helping her pass the alien interface. "It's transmitting a signal. Has been for—" She paused, checking the timestamp. 37 years, 4 months, 16 days. The implications hit Viktor like a physical blow. Since the carrier was supposedly decommissioned. Since it was deliberately hidden, Elena corrected. This was never about nuclear research or weapons development. The Soviets found something, or something found them. A new sound echoed through the chamber, footsteps on metal coming from the passage they'd used to enter. Viktor and Elena ducked behind one of the control stations, peering around its edge as figures emerged into the blue-lit space. 3 people in military fatigues, carrying weapons Viktor didn't recognize. Their leader, a tall woman with short grey hair, moved with the confidence of someone intimately familiar with the chamber's layout. She spoke into a radio in accented English. "Falcon Base, this is Raven 1. The cleaning crew found Section 7 as anticipated. Beacon status remains stable, initiating containment protocol." Viktor's blood ran cold. They'd been expected. The cleaning contract, the mysteriously abandoned carrier, even their discovery of the hidden sections. It had all been orchestrated. The woman gestured to her companions, who began checking the various control stations methodically. "Signal strength has increased 12% in the last month," she continued her radio conversation. "They're definitely getting closer. We may need to accelerate the timeline." Elena grabbed Viktor's arm, pointing toward a maintenance hatch partially concealed behind the cylinder. He nodded, understanding. Moving as quietly as possible, they began crawling toward their only escape route, the pulsing blue light of the beacon casting dancing shadows that helped mask their movement. Behind them, the woman's voice carried a chilling finality and confirmed the cleanup team is standing by. "We can't leave any loose ends this time." The submarine's hull groaned against the carrier's docking clamps as Elena squeezed through the narrow access hatch. The smell hit her first, ozone and metal, but underneath it something organic and wrong. Viktor followed close behind, his breathing labored in the confined space. "This isn't right," Elena whispered, running her hand along the submarine's interior wall. The metal felt warm, almost alive beneath her palm. "Look at this." Where she expected to find typical Soviet submarine controls, banks of unfamiliar equipment lined the walls, smooth, curved surfaces that seemed to pulse with their own internal light. The technology looked decades ahead of anything from the 1980s, yet the construction showed clear signs of Soviet engineering, heavy, utilitarian, built to last. Viktor moved deeper into the vessel, his flashlight beam dancing across impossible geometries. "Elena, you need to see this." The submarine's main compartment had been gutted and rebuilt. Instead of torpedoes and navigation equipment, they found themselves in what could only be described as a laboratory. Examination tables lined the center, restraints still attached. Along the walls, cylindrical tanks rose from floor to ceiling, filled with murky fluid that caught and refracted their flashlight beams. Elena approached one of the tanks, wiping condensation from its surface. Inside, suspended in the fluid, floated what had once been human. The body was pale, hairless, with elongated limbs that seemed to stretch beyond normal proportions. Most disturbing were the modifications: metal ports grafted into the skull, surgical scars that formed deliberate patterns across the torso. "They were experimenting," Viktor said, his voice barely audible. "On people, not just experimenting." Elena moved to another tank, then another. Each contained similar specimens, but the modifications became more extensive, more alien. They were trying to change them into something else. A soft humming filled the air, and several of the tanks began to glow with increased intensity. Elena stumbled backward as the specimen in the nearest tank twitched, its modified eyes opening to stare directly at her through the fluid. "It's alive," she gasped. The humming grew louder, and more specimens began to stir. Viktor grabbed Elena's arm, pulling her toward the far end of the compartment where a sealed door blocked their path. The electronic lock showed a steady red light, but Viktor's military training kicked in. He examined the mechanism, tracing wires and components. "This is Soviet tech, I recognize," he muttered, forcing open a maintenance panel. "But it's been modified with something else, something that shouldn't exist." Behind them, the first tank began to drain with a mechanical whine. Elena watched in horror as the fluid level dropped, revealing more of the creature within. Its chest rose and fell with steady breathing, and the metal ports in its skull flickered with electrical activity. "Viktor, whatever you're doing, do it faster." His fingers worked frantically with the wiring. "There's some kind of fail-safe. The whole system is designed to wake them up if anyone unauthorized enters." The tank emptied completely with a wet, slurping sound. The creature's eyes tracked their movements as it began to shift position, testing limbs that had been suspended for decades. Other tanks throughout the compartment started their draining sequences. Elena found herself staring at documentation scattered across a nearby workstation. The papers were in Russian, but she could make out enough to understand the scope of what they'd discovered. Project Koshchei, it was called, named after the deathless villain of Russian folklore. "They weren't just experimenting on prisoners," she said, reading over technical specifications that made her stomach turn. "They were trying to create a new kind of soldier, something that could survive in space, underwater, in radiation zones. They were preparing for a war unlike anything the world had seen." "Got it!" Viktor's voice cracked with relief as the sealed door hissed open. They plunged through the doorway as the first creature emerged from its tank with a wet, sliding sound. Elena caught a glimpse of it in her peripheral vision, moving with predatory grace despite its modifications, tracking their movements with intelligence that seemed terrifyingly intact. The next compartment contained banks of computers and communication equipment, all humming with active power. Screens displayed data streams in languages Elena couldn't identify, alongside star charts and orbital trajectories that suggested purposes far beyond Earth's atmosphere. "This is a command center," Viktor realized. They weren't just creating these things, they were preparing to deploy them. A new sound reached them from the laboratory behind, multiple splashing impacts as more tanks completed their draining cycles. The creatures were awakening after decades of suspension, and Elena had the terrifying certainty that they retained not just their intelligence, but their original mission parameters. "We have to get word out," Elena said, examining the communication array. "People need to know what's down here." Viktor was already working with the equipment, his military background helping him navigate the hybrid Soviet alien technology. "I'm trying, but this isn't broadcasting to any normal frequencies. It's aimed at coordinates in deep space." The laboratory door behind them shuddered under heavy impact. Whatever they had awakened was coming for them. The emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red as Viktor pulled Elena through the maze of corridors. Behind them, the sound of boots echoed off metal walls. Their pursuers were gaining ground. Elena clutched the data drive containing the decoded files, her other hand pressed against the bleeding gash on her forehead. "This way," Viktor whispered, pulling her into a maintenance shaft he'd discovered during their initial exploration. The space was barely wide enough for their shoulders, forcing them to crawl single file through the darkness. Somewhere above, muffled voices argued in what sounded like English and Russian. "How many of them are there?" Elena gasped. "Too many." Viktor's flashlight illuminated a junction ahead, "But I know this ship better than they do." They emerged into the lower engineering deck, where massive turbine housings created a forest of steel. Viktor had spent hours down here cataloging equipment for the scrap manifest, now that knowledge might save their lives. He led Elena behind a generator, its cold bulk providing cover from the main walkway. "Viktor," she whispered, "what we found in those files." "Not now." He peered around the generator. Two figures in tactical gear moved past, their weapons sweeping methodically. "We need to reach the radio room. The radio's been dead for 20 years. Not the ship's radio. Remember what I told you about Dmitri's stories? About the emergency transmitter the Americans supposedly installed?" Viktor waited until the footsteps faded before continuing. "I thought it was folklore until I found evidence in the manifests. There's a concealed communication array in the forward mast." Elena stared at him. "You've known about this the whole time?" "I suspected. But after what we discovered in that laboratory," Viktor's jaw tightened. "Someone needs to know the truth about what happened here, about what they're still covering up." A new sound reached them, the distant thrum of helicopter rotors. Through a porthole, Viktor saw searchlights sweeping the carrier's deck. Whatever forces were hunting them had serious resources. "Move," he urged. They navigated through the engineering section, using the massive machinery for cover. Viktor's mental map of the ship guided them toward the forward sections, but each corridor seemed to bring new dangers. Twice they had to backtrack when voices echoed ahead. The hunters were coordinating their search, methodically sealing off escape routes. "There." Viktor pointed to a maintenance ladder leading upward. "That connects to the forward superstructure." As Elena climbed, a section of the ladder broke away under her weight. The crash of metal on metal echoed through the chamber like a gunshot. They froze, listening. Shouts erupted from multiple directions, then the pounding of running feet. "Go, go, go!" They burst through a hatch onto the main deck. The helicopter's searchlight immediately swung toward them, turning night into blazing day. Viktor shielded his eyes, pulling Elena toward the towering mast structure that dominated the forward section of the ship. "There!" a voice shouted behind them. The sharp crack of rifle fire followed, bullets sparking off the deck plating near their feet. The mast's base housed a tangle of cable runs and equipment boxes. Viktor frantically searched the markings until he found what he was looking for, a panel marked with Cyrillic characters that didn't match the ship's original specifications. He yanked it open, revealing a compact radio transmitter with American military markings. "How did you—" Elena began. Later, Viktor powered up the device, praying the old electronics would still function. Green lights flickered to life. He grabbed the microphone and began broadcasting on emergency frequencies. "Mayday, Mayday. This is Viktor Petrov aboard the decommissioned carrier Minsk. We have uncovered evidence of biological weapons research conducted during the Cold War. Current location?" The radio exploded in a shower of sparks as a sniper's bullet found its mark. Viktor spun toward Elena, who was staring past his shoulder with wide eyes. "Viktor?" He turned to see armed figures emerging from hatches all around them. At least a dozen men in black tactical gear, weapons trained on their position. The helicopter circled overhead like a mechanical vulture. "Dr. Petrov, Miss Volkov." A familiar voice cut through the engine noise. Director Kozlov stepped into the searchlight's glare, but he wasn't alone. Beside him walked a tall man in an expensive suit, someone Viktor had seen in newspaper photographs, someone whose presence here elevated this far beyond a simple cover-up. "I'm disappointed," Kozlov continued, approaching slowly. "We offered you a very generous arrangement. All you had to do was complete your salvage work and leave. Instead, you chose to become curious." Elena's hand tightened around the data drive. "People have a right to know what you did down there. The experiments, the test subjects." "Test subjects?" The man in the suit laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "My dear, you understand so little. Those weren't test subjects in that laboratory." His smile was predatory. "They were prototypes." Viktor felt the world tilt beneath his feet. The implications of that single word rewrote everything they'd discovered in the hidden chambers below. Not biological weapons research, something far worse. The helicopter's rotors thundered overhead as armed men closed in from all sides. The subdeck vibrated beneath their feet as they descended deeper into the carrier's bowels. Emergency lighting cast twisted shadows that danced with each step. Viktor's flashlight beam cut through the darkness ahead, revealing a corridor that shouldn't exist according to the blueprints they'd studied. Elena pressed close behind him, her breathing shallow. "The air feels different here," she whispered. "Charged, like before a thunderstorm." Viktor nodded, feeling the same electric tension crawling across his skin. They'd been moving through maintenance tunnels for 20 minutes, following Kozlov's hastily scrawled directions. The old scientist had pressed the paper into Viktor's hands before the explosion that sealed their only escape route. "Sector 7 Delta," Viktor read aloud, checking the notation again. "He said we'd know it when we found it." They rounded a corner and stopped. Before them stretched a blast door unlike anything they'd seen on the carrier, seamless steel with no visible hinges or handles, its surface inscribed with Cyrillic warnings that made Viktor's blood run cold. "Authorized personnel only," Elena translated, running her fingers over the etched letters. "Radiation hazard. Biological containment protocols in effect." A low hum emanated from behind the barrier, steady and mechanical. Viktor approached a small panel beside the door, its display screen flickering with amber text. The interface was decades ahead of anything the Soviets had possessed in the 1980s. "This technology," he muttered, studying the holographic projections that materialized above the console. "It's impossible. They couldn't have built this then." Elena's face went pale. "Viktor, look at this." She'd found another panel, this one displaying what appeared to be a facility schematic. The carrier's familiar outline was there, but overlaid with structures that defied comprehension, chambers that extended far beyond the ship's known dimensions, connected by tunnels that seemed to burrow deep into the seafloor itself. "It's not just a ship," she breathed. "It's an entrance." The blast door shuddered, then began to iris open with mechanical precision. No alarm sounded, but the hum grew louder, accompanied by a whisper of air that carried scents Viktor couldn't identify, ozone, copper, and something organic that made his skin crawl. Beyond lay a pristine corridor lined with observation windows. Soft blue light emanated from within the chambers beyond the glass, revealing equipment that belonged in a science fiction film rather than a Cold War relic. They moved forward cautiously. The first window revealed an empty laboratory, its surfaces gleaming with an almost liquid sheen. Workstations curved organically from floor to ceiling, their displays dark but somehow expectant. Elena pointed to symbols etched into the walls, not Cyrillic, not any human language Viktor recognized. The second chamber contained something that made them both freeze. Suspended in a column of azure energy, a humanoid figure floated motionless. Its proportions were wrong, too tall, too angular, with limbs that bent in ways that suggested additional joints. The face, if it could be called that, was obscured by some kind of breathing apparatus connected to the energy field by gossamer threads. "Dear God," Elena whispered. "What did they find?" Victor's mouth was dry as sand. Not what they found, what found them. They passed more windows, more chambers. Some contained artifacts that hurt to look at directly, geometric shapes that seemed to exist in more dimensions than the eye could process. Others held banks of machinery that pulsed with organic rhythms, as if the technology itself was alive. At the corridor's end, they found Kozlov. The scientist sat slumped in a chair before a massive viewing panel, his face slack with exhaustion and something deeper, a haunted recognition that spoke of terrible understanding. Behind the glass stretched a chamber vast enough to house a cathedral, its walls lined with thousands of cylindrical containers, each glowing with that same ethereal blue light. "You came," Kozlov said without turning around. His voice carried the weight of decades. "I wasn't certain you would make it past the security systems." "What is this place?" Viktor demanded. Kozlov finally faced them, and Viktor saw that the old man's eyes held tears. "This is where it began, where we thought we were so clever, so advanced. We detected the signal in 1962, a transmission from deep space, mathematical patterns that proved intelligence beyond our world existed." He gestured to the viewing panel. "We built this facility in secret, convinced we were making first contact. We thought we were the ones reaching out." His laugh was bitter. "We were wrong. They had been waiting for us to develop the technology to hear them, waiting for us to build them a doorway." Elena gripped Viktor's arm. "Those containers—" "Incubation chambers," Kozlov confirmed. "Each one growing something that was designed to replace us, one cell at a time. They've been patient, 30 years of careful infiltration, of learning our weaknesses." He stood slowly, his joints creaking. "But something's changed. The timeline has accelerated. They're ready to move to the final phase." The chamber beyond the glass suddenly blazed with activity as thousands of containers began to pulse in synchronized rhythm. The emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red as Viktor pulled Elena through the maze of corridors. Behind them, the metallic footsteps of Petrov's security team echoed off the bulkheads, growing closer with each passing second. Elena clutched the data drive containing the quantum research files, their only leverage in a game that had already cost too many lives. "This way," Viktor whispered, ducking into a maintenance shaft he'd noticed during their initial exploration. The space was barely wide enough for their shoulders, forcing them to crawl single file through decades of accumulated grime and corrosion. Elena's breathing came in sharp bursts behind him, whether from exertion or terror he couldn't tell. They emerged into what appeared to be the ship's original sick bay, long since stripped of equipment but retaining the antiseptic smell of old medical facilities. Viktor pressed his ear to the door, listening for pursuit. The footsteps had faded, but he knew Petrov's men would be systematic in their search. They had perhaps minutes before discovery. "Viktor!" Elena's voice trembled as she stared at something across the room. "Look at this." A portion of the wall had been torn away, revealing a hidden compartment behind the medical cabinets. Inside, yellow documents spilled from manila folders, and photographs were scattered across a small metal desk. Elena picked up one of the images, a group photo of men in military uniforms standing before what looked like the quantum chamber they'd discovered. "These are the original research team," she said, examining the Cyrillic writing on the back. "Dated 1962. But look," she pointed to a familiar face among the scientists. "That's academician Volkov, the one who supposedly died in a lab accident in 1965. Viktor studied the photograph more closely. The man Elena indicated bore an unmistakable resemblance to someone they'd seen recently. "Elena, what if he didn't die? What if they just changed his identity?" Before she could respond, a new sound reached them. Not the measured footsteps of security, but something else. A low humming that seemed to emanate from the ship's superstructure itself. The lights flickered, and Viktor felt a familiar sensation in his bones, the same vibration they'd experienced near the quantum chamber. "They're activating it," Elena breathed. "The device, they're actually using it." The implications hit Viktor like a physical blow. If Petrov and his people were powering up the quantum research equipment, it meant they weren't just protecting old secrets, they were actively continuing the work. The question was, for what purpose? A sudden crash from the corridor outside sent them scrambling for the exit. Viktor grabbed several of the documents while Elena stuffed more photographs into her jacket. As they slipped out through a different door, the humming intensified and the ship's metal framework began to vibrate noticeably. They found themselves in what had once been the officers' quarters, a series of small cabins connected by a narrow hallway. At the far end, a porthole offered a view of the surrounding scrapyard. Viktor could see lights moving between the rusted hulks of other vessels, more of Petrov's people, sealing off their escape routes. "We're trapped," Elena said, voicing what they both realized. "Even if we could get off the ship, they have the whole area surrounded." Viktor examined the documents they'd salvaged. Most were in technical Russian far beyond his comprehension, but one caught his attention, a progress report dated just 3 months ago. The letterhead bore the symbol of a corporation he recognized from recent news reports, a major defense contractor, with ties to both Russian and American military projects. "This isn't Cold War history," he said, showing Elena the document. "This is current. They're using the quantum research for something happening right now." The ship lurched suddenly, as if something massive had shifted in its lower decks. Emergency klaxons began wailing, and they could hear shouting from multiple directions. Whatever Petrov's team was doing with the quantum device, it wasn't going according to plan. "Maybe this is our chance," Elena suggested. "If they're dealing with an emergency—" Her words were cut off by an explosion that shook the entire vessel. The lights went out completely, plunging them into absolute darkness. In the silence that followed, Viktor could hear only their breathing and the ominous creaking of stressed metal. Then Elena's voice, barely a whisper. "Viktor, I think I understand what they're really doing here. The quantum research, the timing, all of it. But if I'm right, we're not just witnesses to a cover-up, we're witnesses to something that could change the balance of power between nations." Before Viktor could ask what she meant, a new sound reached them through the darkness. Footsteps again, but different this time. Slower, more deliberate. Someone who knew exactly where to find them. A flashlight beam cut through the blackness, and Petrov's voice echoed from the shadows. "Enough games, my friends. It's time we had a proper conversation about what you've seen here." The submarine's hull groaned against the aircraft carrier's underside as Viktor forced the airlock shut behind them. Emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red, and the deck tilted at an unnatural angle that made Elena's stomach lurch. Water sloshed somewhere below, and she could hear the distinctive whine of bilge pumps fighting a losing battle. "This thing's going down," she gasped, still catching her breath from their desperate escape through the flooding chambers. Viktor was already moving toward what looked like a control station. The mysterious data core clutched against his chest like a lifeline. "Not if I can help it." Kozlov didn't just give us an escape route, he gave us a weapon. Through the submarine's periscope housing, Elena caught glimpses of chaos above. Explosions lit the darkness as Petrov's forces engaged with what she assumed were Kozlov's loyalists. The aircraft carrier was tearing itself apart from within, decades of buried secrets erupting into open warfare. "Viktor, look at this." Elena had found a communications array that was somehow still functional. Static-filled voices crackled through multiple frequencies, some in Russian, others in languages she didn't recognize. But the urgency was universal. "Target is secure, repeat, target is secure. Negative, primary asset compromised, initiating contingency. Moscow, we have a problem." Viktor plugged the data core into a port that seemed designed specifically for it. Immediately, screens throughout the submarine flickered to life, displaying information that made Elena's head spin. Technical specifications, geographical coordinates, personnel files with faces she recognized from news broadcasts, politicians, military leaders, industrialists. "My God," Viktor whispered. "It's not just about the experiments. This is a complete network. Everyone who knew, everyone who participated, everyone who's been covering it up for 40 years. Elena studied the scrolling data, her cleaner's eye for detail catching patterns others might miss. Look at the dates. This isn't historical. Some of these entries are from last week, last month. Whatever they were doing on this carrier, it's still happening. A violent shudder ran through the submarine as something massive struck the carrier above them. Through the hull, they could hear the screech of tearing metal and the thunder of collapsing structures. The submarine's automated systems began broadcasting proximity warnings in 3 languages. Viktor's fingers flew over the controls, his background in electronics serving him well. "There's a transmission protocol here. If we can get this information out—" "To who?" Elena interrupted. "Everyone we've encountered has tried to kill us. How do we know who to trust?" "We don't transmit to anyone specific." Viktor's grin was sharp in the emergency lighting. "We transmit to everyone, every frequency, every satellite uplink, every communication network this system can access." Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the North Sea water seeping through the bulkheads. "A data dump. You want to release all of this to the world. It's the only way. Once it's out there, in public, no one can bury it again. No more secrets, no more cover-ups. No more people dying to protect something that should have been exposed decades ago." Another explosion, closer this time. The lights flickered, and Elena heard the unmistakable sound of water rushing through compromised compartments. They had minutes at most before the submarine either flooded completely or was crushed by the sinking carrier. "Do it," she said. Viktor initiated the sequence. Progress bars crept across multiple screens as terabytes of classified data began broadcasting across every available channel. Elena watched coordinates scroll past, other facilities, other sites where similar experiments might still be continuing, names and faces of people in positions of power who had enabled decades of human suffering in the name of national security. The submarine lurched violently as the aircraft carrier above them began its final descent toward the ocean floor. Emergency klaxons wailed, and Viktor grabbed Elena's hand as they searched desperately for another way out. There, Elena pointed to what looked like an escape pod embedded in the submarine's hull. "It's designed to surface automatically." They squeezed into the cramped space, just as water began rushing into the main compartment. Through the pod's small porthole, Elena watched the submarine disappear into the darkness, taking with it the last physical evidence of the carrier's secrets. But the data was out there now, spreading across the globe faster than any government could contain it. The escape pod shot toward the surface with nauseating speed. Elena felt her ears pop as they breached, emerging into a world of chaos and burning debris. The aircraft carrier was gone, leaving only an oil slick and scattered wreckage to mark where it had been. In the distance, Elena could see lights, rescue vessels, military ships, news helicopters drawn by the massive explosion. Soon the world would know about their data transmission. Soon the questions would begin. Viktor squeezed her hand as their pod's beacon began transmitting their location. "Think anyone will believe us?" Elena smiled grimly, watching the approaching lights. "After tonight, they won't have a choice." The emergency klaxon's wail echoed through the carrier's corridors as Viktor pulled Elena behind him, their feet splashing through ankle-deep water that had begun flooding the lower decks. Behind them, the sound of heavy boots and shouted commands in multiple languages grew closer. "The extraction point," Elena gasped, clutching the waterproof case containing the decoded files. "We'll never make it to the helicopter pad." Viktor's mind raced through the ship's layout they'd memorized during their weeks aboard. The carrier was listing 15 degrees to starboard now, and he could hear the groaning of stressed metal as the deliberate scuttling charges did their work. Whoever wanted this ship's secrets buried was willing to sacrifice a piece of naval history to ensure silence. "This way," he said, turning toward a maintenance shaft they'd discovered during their cleaning operations. "The old missile storage bay has an external hatch." They crawled through the narrow passage as the ship shuddered around them. Elena's breathing was labored, and Viktor could see blood seeping through her makeshift bandage where the bullet had grazed her shoulder. The case bumped against the shaft walls as they moved, each impact making him wince. Those files were humanity's only proof of what had really happened during those missing months of 1962. The truth was more devastating than either of them had imagined. The experiments hadn't just been about creating psychic soldiers. Dr. Volkov's team had succeeded in opening something, a doorway that wasn't bound by the normal rules of physics. The test subjects hadn't died from the procedures, they'd been transformed into something else entirely, something that existed partially outside normal space-time. And that doorway was still open. They emerged into the missile bay just as the lights went out. Emergency illumination cast everything in hellish red, and Viktor could hear water rushing in from multiple breaches. The external hatch was 20 feet away, but between them and escape stood 3 figures in tactical gear, their faces hidden behind masks that looked disturbingly similar to the breathing apparatus they'd found in Volkov's laboratory. "Stand down," one of them called out in accented English. "You have something that belongs to us." Viktor stepped protectively in front of Elena, his cleaning supplies still somehow clipped to his belt, absurd detail that might have been funny under different circumstances. "These files belong to the world. People have a right to know what their governments did." The lead figure raised his weapon, but before he could fire, the ship lurched violently to port. The sudden movement sent all of them tumbling across the tilting deck. Viktor grabbed Elena's hand and dove for the hatch controls, slamming his fist against the emergency release. Cold Baltic air rushed in along with spray from the churning sea below. The carrier was going down faster than expected, its hull compromised in ways that suggested this wasn't just about sinking evidence. Someone wanted to ensure that nothing and no one survived to tell the tale. "Jump!" Viktor shouted over the wind, but Elena was staring past him with an expression of absolute terror. He turned to see what had frozen her in place and felt his own blood turn to ice. The sealed doorway they'd discovered in the laboratory levels, the one that had hummed with impossible energy, had somehow been breached. Through the flooding corridors came shapes that hurt to look at directly, figures that moved with purposes that defied human understanding. The test subjects weren't dead, they'd been waiting. The tactical team opened fire, but their bullets seemed to pass harmlessly through the approaching entities. One of the gunmen screamed as something invisible wrapped around him, lifting him into the air before hurling him against the bulkhead with bone-crushing force. "The files," Elena whispered urgently. "They're not just documentation, they're a containment protocol. Volkov knew this would happen eventually." Viktor looked at the case in her hands, understanding flooding through him. The seemingly random data they'd decoded wasn't just evidence of experiments. It was a carefully constructed key, designed to seal what had been opened, but using it would require someone to stay behind, to manually input the shutdown sequence from the ship's original command center. The carrier groaned again, settling deeper into the water. Through the open hatch, Viktor could see lights approaching across the dark sea. Rescue boats or more hostiles, it was impossible to tell. Elena pressed the case into his hands. "Get this to the surface. Find someone who understands quantum physics and Cold War cryptography. The shutdown sequence is in there, but it needs to be transmitted from a specific frequency array." "I'm not leaving you," Viktor said, but even as he spoke, he could see the determination in her eyes. The things from the laboratory were getting closer, and reality seemed to bend around them like heat haze. Elena smiled sadly and pushed him toward the hatch. "Someone has to tell this story," she said. "Someone has to warn them that the door is still open." The helicopter's rotors whipped salt spray across the deck as Viktor helped Elena climb aboard, her injured arm cradled against her chest. The pilot, a weathered man who asked no questions about the smoking wreckage behind them, lifted off immediately, banking hard toward the distant coastline. Below them, the Minsk listed heavily to port, orange flames licking at her superstructure. The explosions had torn through the hidden laboratory levels, sending decades of classified research to the bottom of the Baltic Sea. Viktor watched the carrier's death throes through the window, feeling a strange mixture of relief and loss. "The drives!" Elena shouted over the engine noise, patting the waterproof bag secured to her belt. "Everything's here, the genetic research, the weapons programs, the cover-up documentation." Viktor nodded, but his attention was fixed on 3 black helicopters rising from the water behind them. Military aircraft, moving fast and closing the distance. Their pilot noticed too, pushing the civilian chopper to its limits as they raced towards Swedish territorial waters. "Hold on," the pilot called back. "This is going to get rough." The first burst of machine gun fire stitched across the water 50 meters to their left. Their pilot dove toward the wave tops, using the sea spray to mask their position. Elena gripped Viktor's hand as they weaved between the pursuing aircraft, the stolen data bouncing against her hip with each violent maneuver. Viktor's satellite phone buzzed. Somehow, impossibly, Dr. Sarah Chen's voice came through clearly, despite the chaos. "Viktor, are you receiving? The story broke 20 minutes ago. Every major network, simultaneously." Elena's journalist contact had worked faster than expected. While they'd been fighting for their lives in the Minsk's bowels, leaked documents were already spreading across the internet like wildfire. Genetic weapons research, human experimentation, international conspiracy, the kind of story that couldn't be buried or dismissed. "Chen!" Viktor shouted into the phone. "The pursuit aircraft, can you call them off?" "Already done. As of 5 minutes ago, this became a very public international incident. Nobody wants to be caught shooting down civilians carrying evidence of war crimes." As if responding to her words, the black helicopters began to fall back. Viktor watched them turn toward the burning carrier, their mission parameters apparently changed by the sudden media exposure. An hour later, they stood in a Stockholm police station, watching news coverage on a mounted television. The Minsk was gone, claimed by the Baltic's cold waters, but her secrets were spreading across every news channel on the planet. Grainy photographs of laboratory equipment, genetic research data, and most damning of all, personnel records showing the conspiracy reached into the highest levels of multiple governments. "Mr. Petrov, Miss Volkov," the Swedish inspector approached with papers in hand. "Your asylum requests have been fast-tracked. Under the circumstances, I think we can guarantee your safety." Elena flexed her bandaged arm, wincing slightly. The bullet had passed through cleanly, but she'd need weeks to heal properly. Still, she managed a tired smile as she watched government officials on 3 continents scrambling to distance themselves from the revelations. "What happens now?" she asked Viktor quietly. "Now we disappear for a while," he replied. "Let the lawyers and politicians sort this mess out. We've done our part." Dr. Chen appeared on the television screen, flanked by other geneticists at a hastily organized press conference. She was explaining the implications of the leaked research, her words measured but damning. The presenter mentioned that initial investigations suggested the program had been terminated decades ago, but that several government officials had continued the cover-up to protect their careers. Viktor thought about the files Elena had recovered. Names, dates, financial transfers, enough evidence to topple administrations and send people to prison. The cleaners had become whistleblowers, their discovery aboard a rusting carrier threatening to rewrite the history of genetic warfare. "There's something else," Elena said, pulling a small data chip from her jacket pocket. "I found this in Kozlov's personal files. It's not part of the research data." Viktor examined the unmarked chip. "What do you think it contains?" "Bank records, maybe. Personal insurance. Men like Kozlov always keep leverage on their partners." She slipped it back into her pocket. Something for later, when things calmed down. Outside the police station windows, Stockholm's evening lights twinkled peacefully. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that 2 desperate cleaners had just prevented a genetic weapons program from falling into the wrong hands. Viktor found comfort in that normalcy, in the promise of anonymity that lay ahead. Elena leaned against his shoulder, exhaustion finally overtaking adrenaline. They'd boarded the Minsk looking for scrap metal and found themselves at the center of an international conspiracy. Now they were survivors, witnesses, and refugees all at once. "Think they'll leave us alone?" Elena asked drowsily. Viktor watched the news coverage continue, showing investigators already mobilizing across multiple countries. The secret was too big now, too public to contain. "I think they'll have bigger problems to worry about," he said.